The United States Congress has just voted to force a sitting president out of office. And the president answered with 3 words that could push the Constitution to its limits: "I am not leaving." Washington, District of Columbia, 2:17 in the afternoon Eastern Time. Inside the United States Capitol, an extraordinary legislative action has just entered the official record of the United States Congress. The House of Representatives and the Senate have completed an emergency vote. The numbers are already circulating through Washington. In the House of Representatives, the vote stands at 268 to 167. In the Senate, the vote stands at 61 to 39. Both chambers have declared that a joint congressional resolution has passed, and the language of that resolution is direct. President Donald Trump must leave office immediately. Pause for a moment and consider what that means inside the structure of American government. The legislative branch has just voted to demand the immediate departure of a sitting president. And only minutes after the result became official, the White House issued its response. Donald Trump refused. He will not leave the White House. Let that land properly. Congress has acted. The president has rejected the authority of that action. And just like that, Washington has entered a direct collision between the legislative branch and the executive branch of the United States government. This is not a messaging dispute. This is not a campaign confrontation. This is a constitutional pressure point. And to understand how the system reached this moment, you have to start with the trigger. The process began with what congressional leadership described as an emergency resolution. Members of Congress invoked 2 institutional pillars. First, congressional emergency authority under internal legislative procedure. Second, the broader constitutional obligation of Congress to defend the federal constitutional order. After hours of procedural debate, both chambers moved forward with a vote. The House of Representatives acted first. 268 members voted in favor of the resolution. 167 members voted against it. Then the Senate followed. 61 senators voted in support. 39 senators opposed it. Those numbers matter because they establish a clear institutional position. Congressional leadership then issued the declaration attached to the resolution. According to that declaration, Donald Trump must leave office immediately under the authority of the joint resolution. But the process did not end there, because the White House did not recognize the resolution as binding authority. The response from the executive branch was direct. According to the official statement, the president will continue carrying out the constitutional duties of the office. Here's where you need to understand the deeper institutional context. When one branch of the federal government issues a demand that another branch rejects outright, the question shifts. It stops being about politics. It becomes about power inside the constitutional system, and that shift has already begun. The resolution itself triggered a chain of institutional mechanisms almost immediately. First, the vote created an emergency joint congressional resolution, formally adopted by both chambers. Second, the matter was referred to the United States Department of Justice. Third, congressional officials indicated that constitutional litigation in federal court could follow if enforcement becomes contested. And fourth, the resolution effectively calls on the executive branch to carry out the decision. Now stop there, because this is where the tension becomes unavoidable. Congress can legislate, Congress can oversee, Congress can pass resolutions. But Congress does not directly command the federal enforcement apparatus. Execution of federal authority belongs to the executive branch, the same executive branch currently led by the president being ordered to step down. Let me say that again so it lands properly. The branch demanding enforcement does not control the machinery that would enforce it, and the branch that controls enforcement is the one rejecting the demand. This is where the system moves from procedure into institutional stress. At the center of this moment are the leaders of the United States Congress, the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader. These offices controlled the procedural engine that produced the vote. They authorized the emergency debate, they presided over the vote, they signed the joint resolution, and they transmitted that resolution to the relevant federal institutions. The authorities used here are well established. Legislative authority, congressional oversight powers, emergency procedural powers. But those authorities now sit at the edge of a much larger institutional question, because the next step could still move in more than one direction. If congressional leadership slows the procedural escalation, the confrontation could shift toward legal review. If they accelerate the process or pursue immediate litigation, the conflict may move directly into the federal judiciary. And that possibility matters more than it may appear at first glance. Because once federal courts enter the arena, the confrontation stops being procedural. It becomes constitutional. At the center of the current standoff stand three pillars of American federal power: Congress, the President, and the federal enforcement system. The tension now turns on a single, unresolved question. Can Congress force a sitting president out of office through a joint resolution like this? The Constitution provides two clearly defined mechanisms for presidential removal: impeachment and the 25th Amendment. But a joint congressional resolution demanding immediate departure, there is no clear historical precedent for that pathway. And that absence of precedent is precisely why Washington is paying such close attention tonight. Because when the constitutional system enters territory without precedent, the boundaries of power become uncertain. Two branches of government are now asserting incompatible authority over the same office. Congress says the president must leave. The president says the resolution has no binding force. That gap between those positions is where constitutional pressure begins to build. And that pressure matters for three reasons. First, the scale of authority involved. The legislative branch and the executive branch are both asserting power at the highest level of the federal system. Second, the stress on the system of checks and balances. The American constitutional design expects conflict between branches. But certain confrontations push that design toward its operational limits. Third, the absence of precedent. Modern American history has seen impeachment battles. It has seen executive-legislative confrontations, but it has never seen a moment where Congress votes to force a president out through a resolution while the president immediately refuses to leave the White House. And that combination changes the terrain, because in this hypothetical scenario, the facts now stand exactly here. Congress has voted 268 to 167 in the House and 61 to 39 in the Senate, demanding that Donald Trump leave office. Donald Trump has declared that he will remain in the White House. And the space between those two positions is where something rare in Washington is beginning to take shape. Not a political dispute, a test of the constitutional system itself. And the next move inside that system may determine whether this confrontation stays procedural or becomes something far more serious. The procedural escalation begins almost immediately after the vote is completed and entered into the congressional record. What starts as a legislative action quickly moves into a broader institutional process. The first step occurs when Congress passes a joint resolution calling for President Donald Trump to leave office. The results show clear support from both chambers of Congress. In the House of Representatives, the measure passes with 268 votes in favor and 167 opposed. In the Senate, the vote stands at 61 in favor and 39 against. When both chambers align on a decision of this scale, it signals that the legislative branch has taken a formal and coordinated position. The second step follows soon after the vote. The resolution is formally transmitted to the Department of Justice and the Office of the Attorney General. This step is part of the procedural chain that often accompanies major congressional actions. Congress can pass resolutions and express institutional demands, but the evaluation of legal enforceability usually falls within the authority of federal legal institutions. By sending the document to these offices, lawmakers are effectively asking the federal legal system to review the implications of the resolution. The third step emerges when a group of lawmakers formally requests that the Department of Justice examine whether the resolution could be enforced under federal law. Their request centers on a basic legal question. Does a joint resolution passed by both chambers create a binding obligation for a president to leave office, or is it simply a statement of congressional intent? This question places the Department of Justice in an important position because its legal interpretation could shape what happens next. The fourth step appears when the White House responds. Officials representing the executive branch state that the resolution does not carry binding authority over the President of the United States. According to this interpretation, Congress cannot compel a sitting president to leave office through a joint resolution alone. The administration therefore rejects the idea that the resolution can be enforced. At this moment, several of the institutional pathways begin to narrow. Congress has already taken its vote, but the executive branch refuses to recognize the resolution as legally binding. As the situation develops, responses begin to spread across different parts of the federal government. The White House continues to maintain that the president remains the lawful commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces. The president's official schedule proceeds as normal, and the daily operations of the executive branch continue without interruption. From the administration's perspective, the resolution does not alter presidential authority. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice enters a period of legal evaluation. Lawyers within the department begin reviewing the constitutional and statutory foundation of the congressional resolution. Part of this process involves determining whether the issue could eventually lead to judicial review. If the disagreement between Congress and the executive branch becomes a legal case, federal courts could be asked to interpret the Constitution and determine the limits of authority for each branch of government. At the same time, discussion begins within Congress about the possibility of bringing the dispute before the federal courts. Some lawmakers argue that if the executive branch continues to reject the resolution, the matter should be settled through the judicial system. Filing a case in federal court would shift the conflict from a political confrontation into a constitutional legal dispute. In that scenario, judges would examine the claims of each branch and determine whether the resolution carries any enforceable legal power. This evolving situation illustrates the functioning of the American system of checks and balances. Each branch of government is exercising its own interpretation of constitutional authority. Congress has used its legislative power to pass a resolution supported by majorities in both chambers. The executive branch has responded by challenging the legal force of that action. The judicial branch has not yet intervened, but it could become involved if a formal case is filed. At the same time, the limits of each branch are being tested. Congress has the authority to legislate and pass resolutions, but it does not possess its own enforcement mechanism capable of directly removing a president outside the impeachment process. The president, on the other hand, controls the executive branch and the federal agencies responsible for implementing federal law. The courts occupy a different position within the system. They generally intervene only when a specific legal dispute is brought before them. Because of these institutional limits, the constitutional boundary between the branches becomes increasingly important. Legislative authority, executive authority, and judicial review are all being pushed toward their limits in this hypothetical situation. American history includes examples of presidential impeachments and numerous constitutional disputes between branches of government. However, there is no clear historical precedent for Congress attempting to require a sitting president to leave office through a joint resolution alone. That lack of precedent makes the next phase of events particularly significant. Several possible developments are now being closely watched. The Department of Justice could issue a formal legal opinion explaining whether the resolution has any enforceable authority. Lawmakers who support the measure could file a constitutional lawsuit in federal court seeking judicial clarification. If such a case moves through the federal court system, the Supreme Court could ultimately be asked to interpret the constitutional powers involved. Some members of Congress have also proposed a time frame for the next step. They have suggested that the Department of Justice provide its legal assessment within 48 hours. The idea behind this proposal is to force a clearer institutional response and determine whether the situation will move toward the courts or remain a political dispute. Several developments could trigger further escalation. A court order could change the legal dynamics if a lawsuit is filed and accepted for review. Congress might adopt additional resolutions or legislative actions to reinforce its position. The Department of Justice could also issue a determination that influences how the federal government responds to the conflict. In this hypothetical scenario, the American political system would be entering a rare constitutional stress test. The situation would no longer be simply a political disagreement between institutions. Instead, it would become a fundamental question about the balance of power within the federal government at a moment when Congress has voted 268 to 167 in the House and 61 to 39 in the Senate, while the president refuses to leave office. As the situation continues to unfold, observers across the legal and political landscape are beginning to focus on several indicators that may reveal which direction the institutional system is moving. These signals do not provide definitive answers, but together they form a framework for understanding whether the confrontation between Congress and the executive branch will cool down, escalate, or transform into something deeper. The first indicator is the legal response from the Department of Justice. The department's interpretation will carry considerable weight because it sits at the intersection between law and executive authority. A carefully written legal opinion could clarify whether the congressional resolution has any enforceable standing or whether it remains purely symbolic. Even if such an opinion does not settle the matter entirely, it would shape how other federal institutions approach the dispute. The second indicator concerns the federal courts. A key question is whether a federal court would agree to hear a lawsuit related to the conflict. Courts in the United States often evaluate whether a case presents a justiciable issue or whether it falls into the category of a political question that the judiciary should avoid. If a federal court accepts the case, the matter could move into a structured legal process. If the courts decline to intervene, the dispute may remain within the political branches. The third indicator is the continuing stance of the White House. The executive branch has already stated that the resolution does not have binding authority over the president. The next signals will come from how firmly that position is maintained. Official statements, policy decisions, and the tone of communication from the administration may reveal whether the White House intends to hold its ground or seek a path toward institutional de-escalation. The fourth indicator lies within Congress itself. After the vote of 268 to 167 in the House of Representatives and 61 to 39 in the Senate, lawmakers now face the question of what comes next. Congress could allow the matter to move toward legal review, or it could pursue additional legislative measures. The willingness of legislators to introduce further resolutions or procedural actions will provide an important signal about whether the confrontation is stabilizing or intensifying. The fifth indicator involves the response of other federal agencies. Departments across the federal government operate within the executive branch, yet they also interact with Congress through oversight funding and regulatory responsibilities. Their behavior, whether cautious, assertive, or neutral, may reveal how the broader administrative structure is interpreting the institutional moment. The sixth and final indicator concerns the pace of legal procedures. Constitutional disputes sometimes unfold slowly through lengthy court processes. In other cases, urgent political pressure accelerates legal decisions. The speed at which opinions, filings, and rulings appear will shape how quickly the nation moves toward clarity. When analysts examine these indicators together, three broad scenarios begin to emerge. The first scenario is a form of institutional cooling. In this pathway, the dispute gradually moves into the judicial arena. Congress, the executive branch, and legal advocates would present arguments before federal courts while waiting for judicial interpretation. Under this scenario, the confrontation shifts from political declarations to legal reasoning, and the temperature of the conflict could temporarily stabilize while the courts deliberate. The second scenario involves procedural escalation. In this version of events, Congress does not pause after the initial vote. Instead, lawmakers could adopt additional resolutions or legislative measures intended to reinforce their position. At the same time, multiple constitutional lawsuits might be filed in different jurisdictions, creating a complex legal landscape. Rather than reducing tension, the system would experience a series of overlapping procedural battles across branches of government. The third scenario is the possibility of a deeper institutional crisis. In such a situation, both branches of government would continue to assert conflicting authority. Congress might insist that its vote represents a legitimate exercise of legislative power, while the executive branch maintains that the resolution cannot compel presidential action. If neither side retreats and judicial clarification remains uncertain, the conflict could evolve into a prolonged struggle over constitutional interpretation. Beyond these scenarios, the broader consequences of the confrontation can be examined through several dimensions. From a legal perspective, the constitutional system would face a new question about the scope of congressional authority after a vote of 268 to 167 in the House and 61 to 39 in the Senate. Even if the immediate dispute is eventually resolved, the debate could leave lasting implications for how the powers of Congress are understood. From the standpoint of national security, attention naturally turns to the stability of the executive branch. The president holds central authority over military command and foreign policy decision-making. Any uncertainty surrounding executive legitimacy or institutional conflict would inevitably be watched closely by officials responsible for maintaining national security continuity. The political dimension is equally significant. Relations between Congress and the White House could enter a period of intense strain. Cooperation on legislation oversight and policy initiatives might become more difficult as both sides navigate the fallout from such an extraordinary confrontation. The electoral environment could also be influenced. Institutional disputes of this magnitude often shape public debate and political narratives. Voters, candidates, and political organizations may interpret the conflict in different ways, potentially affecting campaign strategies and public discourse in upcoming elections. The geopolitical dimension extends beyond the borders of the United States. Allies and international partners tend to watch closely when constitutional questions arise within the American system. At the same time, geopolitical competitors may also observe how resilient the system proves to be when confronted with internal institutional pressure. All of these developments ultimately point towards several fundamental constitutional questions that remain unresolved. One question concerns the precise boundary of presidential authority. Another question asks how the system of checks and balances manages a direct collision between two branches of government. A third question reaches even deeper: whether the constitutional structure of the United States possesses sufficient mechanisms of self-correction when Congress votes 268 to 167 in the tyranny House and 61 to 39 in the Senate, while the president refuses to leave office. Those questions do not lead to a simple conclusion. Instead, they open a continuing debate about how constitutional institutions respond when the written structure of authority encounters a moment of extraordinary political tension.